After the tragic death of his wife, Alessandro's estate became a heavily guarded fortress, and trust became a currency he no longer spent. Alessandro Moretti was a ghost in the underworld, a man who built a ruthless, untouchable empire on the foundations of silence and absolute loyalty. To his enemies, he was a monster with cold eyes and tattooed forearms that had seen too much blood. But to his 6-year-old daughter, Isabella, he was just a father who was failing to reach her. When Sofia Bennett, a warm-hearted nanny in a red maid's dress, managed to bring a flicker of life back into his daughter's hollow eyes, Alessandro thought he had finally found a shred of peace. But in his world, peace is a lethal illusion. He fired Sofia with icy cruelty, believing he was cutting out a traitor, only to find his daughter sobbing in the dark later that night. It was then that Isabella whispered a secret, a truth so devastating it brought the city's most feared crime boss to his knees in a breakdown of pure, agonizing regret. Subscribe to this family to keep getting entertaining stories like this. The fortress of silence, the Moretti estate, sat like a stone sentinel on acres of isolated land, surrounded by iron fences and motion sensors. To the authorities, it was the nerve center of a criminal syndicate. To Alessandro, it was a prison he had built to keep Isabella safe. Ever since the tragedy that took his wife 2 years prior, Alessandro's heart had calcified. He expanded his territory with a brutal efficiency that left rivals in ruins, but inside the mahogany-lined walls of his own home, he was losing the only battle that mattered. 6-year-old Isabella hadn't spoken more than a handful of words since her mother's funeral. Trauma had locked her inside her own mind, leaving her a shell of the vibrant child she once was. Alessandro had hired and fired a dozen nannies. Some were too terrified of the armed guards in the halls. Others were too clinical. Then came Sofia Bennett. Sofia was in her late 20s with long brown hair and a quiet strength that didn't falter when she stepped into the compound. On paper, she was unremarkable, a foster system survivor with a degree in childhood development and no ties to the police. But from the moment she arrived, the atmosphere began to shift. She didn't flinch at the black SUVs or the tattooed men in the kitchen. Her entire world was focused on Isabella. Watch from the shadows of his study as Sofia worked a slow, patient magic. At first, Isabella ignored her, staring blankly out the reinforced glass windows, but Sofia didn't push. She simply sat nearby, reading stories and painting. By the 3rd week, Alessandro checked the security cameras and felt his breath catch. Isabella was resting her small head on Sofia's shoulder, helping her turn the pages of a book. For the next 6 months, small rays of light pierced the gloom of the estate. Sofia taught Isabella to bake and took her into the gardens to find fireflies. She was fiercely protective, once even stepping between the child and a high-ranking captain who had raised his voice. Alessandro felt a strange, unsettling gratitude toward her. In a world where everyone wanted his power or his life, Sofia seemed to only want to see his daughter smile. He began to notice her sharp intelligence and the way she was never truly afraid of the devil of Chicago. But in the Mafia, vulnerability is a death sentence, and Alessandro was about to learn that in his house, nothing pure was allowed to survive without a fight. The mahogany-lined walls of the Moretti estate didn't just absorb sound, they seemed to swallow hope. To the outside world, this 30-acre fortress was a monument to Alessandro Moretti's absolute power, a place where the air tasted of expensive scotch and the heavy, metallic scent of unspoken threats. To Alessandro, it was a necessary cage. He moved through the high-ceilinged corridors with the silent, predatory grace of a man who knew that a single misplaced footstep could trigger a war. His tailored black suit moved with him like a second skin, concealing the intricate ink that mapped his violent history across his forearms. He was the devil of Chicago, a man who had turned grief into a weapon, expanding his empire with a cold, surgical precision that left his rivals in ruins. But every time he passed the heavy oak door of the second-floor playroom, the devil was reminded of his greatest defeat. Inside, the world was painted in muted pastels and the soft glow of designer lamps, yet it felt colder than any interrogation room Alessandro had ever stepped into. 6-year-old Isabella sat by the reinforced glass window, her small, delicate frame enveloped by a pale yellow dress that seemed too bright for the shadows in her eyes. She was a masterpiece of stillness. Since the day the car bomb had turned their world into a pillar of fire and twisted metal, Isabella had retreated into a sanctuary of silence that no doctor, specialist, or high-priced therapist could breach. Alessandro stood in the doorway, his large shadow stretching across the plush carpet toward his daughter's feet. He wanted to kneel beside her, to pull her into his chest and promise her that the world was safe again. But the words always died in his throat, choked by the crushing weight of his own guilt. He was the one who had brought the violence to their doorstep. He was the reason her mother was a memory kept in a closed casket. "Isabella," he murmured, his voice uncharacteristically thick. The child didn't turn. She continued to stare out at the rolling green lawns where men in tactical gear paced the perimeter with submachine guns slung over their shoulders. To her, those men weren't protectors. They were reminders of the monsters that lived outside the fence, and perhaps the one that lived inside the house. Alessandro's jaw tightened. He felt the familiar, burning itch of frustration beneath his skin. In the boardroom or the backstreets, he could command 1,000 men with a look. He could negotiate multi-million-dollar deals and silence dissent with a single word. But here, in the presence of his own flesh and blood, he was powerless. He was a king without a voice, ruling over a kingdom of ghosts. He walked to his study, the clicking of his Italian leather shoes echoing like a countdown. The room was a fortress within a fortress, filled with the hum of encrypted servers and the flickering glow of security monitors. Silas Mercer, his underboss, was already there, leaning over a desk covered in ledgers and surveillance photos. Silas was a man of sharp angles and even sharper eyes, a paranoid tactician who saw a knife in every shadow. "Genovese's family is pushing the border in the north," said without looking up, his voice a dry rasp. "They think you're distracted, Alessandro. They think the house is leaking." Alessandro sat behind his heavy desk, the leather creaking under his weight. He looked at the monitors. One screen showed the front gate, another showed the armory, and the third showed Isabella still sitting by that window, a tiny speck of yellow in a gray world. "Them think what they want," Alessandro replied coldly, though his eyes remained fixed on his daughter's image. "If they cross the line, bury them. I don't pay you to bring me rumors, Silas. I pay you for results." "My results are only as good as your focus," Silas countered, finally looking up. His eyes darted to the monitor showing Isabella. "The girl needs to be handled. This situation is making the captains nervous. They see a boss who spends more time watching a silent child than watching his boarders. It makes us look vulnerable." Air in the room suddenly turned frigid. Alessandro leaned forward, his dark eyes boring into Silas with a lethality that made the underboss visibly stiffen. "My daughter is not a situation, Silas. She is a Morty. And if any of my captains have a problem with how I run my house, they can discuss it with me personally. In the basement." Silas lowered his gaze, the corners of his mouth twitching in a way that suggested he was tucking that insult away for later. "Of course, Alessandro. I only meant that the house needs order. The last nanny quit this morning. She said the atmosphere was oppressive." "Was weak," Alessandro snapped, though the words felt hollow. They were all weak, or too clinical, or too terrified. He had watched a dozen women walk through those gates with smiles and resumes, only to flee within a month, unable to handle the weight of Isabella's silence or the coldness of the man who employed them. He looked back at the screen. Isabella had moved. She was now clutching a small, tattered teddy bear, the last thing her mother had bought her. She wasn't playing, she was just holding it, her knuckles white, as if she were hanging onto the last piece of a sinking ship. A wave of profound exhaustion washed over Alessandro. He was a man who lived for control. Yet he was watching his daughter drift further away every single day. He was building a legacy of blood and gold, but for whom? If Isabella never spoke again, if she never smiled or laughed, then every kill, every deal, and every inch of territory won was meaningless. "Find someone else," Alessandro said, his voice dropping to a weary growl. "I don't care about the cost. I don't care about the resume. Find someone who isn't afraid of the dark, someone who can reach her." "Already started the search," Silas said, stepping back toward the door. "But be careful, Alessandro. Bringing a stranger into the heart of this estate. It's a risk we can't afford. Loyalty is a rare thing these days. I don't need her loyalty, Alessandro said, turning his chair back toward the window. I need her to do what I can. After Silas left, Alessandro remained in the dark, the only light coming from the monitors. He watched Isabella for hours, a silent sentinel guarding a silent child. He thought about the mahogany walls, the iron fences, and the blood on his hands. He had built a palace to keep the world out, but in doing so, he had trapped his daughter in a prison of his own making. He reached out and touched the screen, his thumb brushing over Isabella's small, tear-streaked face. "Talk to me, Bella," he whispered into the empty room. "Just one word. Give me something to fight for." But the only answer was the hum of the servers and the distant, muffled sound of a guard's boots on the gravel outside. The Moretti estate remained a fortress of silence, a mahogany prison where a king sat on a throne of shadows, waiting for a miracle he didn't believe he deserved. He didn't know then that the miracle was already on her way, dressed in a simple red dress and carrying a heart that hadn't yet been hardened by the world he ruled. He didn't know that soon the silence would be broken, and the truth would be the most dangerous weapon of all. The iron gates of the Moretti estate groaned as they slid open, a sound like a giant drawing a breath. A modest silver sedan rolled up the long, winding driveway, flanked by the kind of security usually reserved for heads of state. From his second-floor study, Alessandro watched the vehicle come to a halt. He expected another terrified candidate, a woman who would step out, see the men with holstered sidearms and earpieces, and immediately begin to shrink. Then the door opened, and Sofia Bennett stepped out. She was wearing a simple red dress that stood out against the gray stone of the driveway like a drop of blood on snow. A beige apron was folded neatly over her arm, and her long brown hair was tied back, revealing a face that held a startling, quiet composure. As she stood there, 3 of Alessandro's heaviest guards, men who could make a seasoned hitman sweat, closed in to begin the mandatory sweep. They moved with a deliberate, intimidating bulk, their shadows falling over her. Most people stilled or trembled. Sofia didn't even blink. One guard, a scarred veteran named Marco, stepped into her personal space, his hand resting conspicuously on his belt. He reached for her small suitcase with a grunt, intending to wrench it away for inspection. Sofia didn't pull back. She met his gaze with a look of calm expectation, holding the handle of the bag until he took it with a measure of forced professional care rather than aggression. She didn't look at the guns. She looked at the men, acknowledging their presence without granting them the satisfaction of her fear. "I'm Sofia," she said, her voice carrying through the humid Chicago air, reaching Alessandro's window with a clarity that surprised him. "I believe I am expected." Alessandro stayed behind the glass, his eyes narrowed. He watched as they led her through the massive front doors, her red dress disappearing into the mahogany gloom of the foyer. He waited a few minutes, allowing the house to swallow her before he made his way downstairs. He found her standing in the center of the grand hall. She was surrounded by the opulence of his life, the Renaissance paintings, the marble floors, the gold leaf detailing, but she wasn't looking at the wealth. She was looking at a small, discarded crayon drawing pinned to a side table, her expression one of soft, focused curiosity. "Security protocols are not for show, Miss Bennett," Alessandro said, his voice echoing as he descended the final few steps. Sofia turned. She didn't gasping or startle. She took in the sight of him, the tailored suit, the tattoos peeking from his cuffs, the cold authority in his eyes, and she simply nodded. "I understand. You have much to protect. But a fortress doesn't need to feel like a tomb, Mr. Moretti." Alessandro stopped a few feet from her. He was a head taller, his presence designed to dominate any room, yet she stood her ground. "You were vetted by Silas. He says you have no family, no ties, and no fear. 2 of those things I can verify. The third, we shall see." "Fear is a choice," Sofia replied evenly. "I've spent my life in systems and places where being afraid didn't change the outcome. I am here for Isabella." "Where is she?" Her directness was a shock to his system. No one spoke to him without a preamble of Sir or Mr. Moretti or a visible tremor of hesitation. He turned without a word and led her toward the playroom. As they walked, a captain named Rocco stepped out of a side room, arguing loudly into a phone about a shipment of hardware. The man was agitated, his voice booming and aggressive. Sofia didn't even turn her head. She walked past him as if he were a noisy ghost, her eyes fixed on the hallway ahead. They reached the heavy oak door. Alessandro paused, his hand on the handle. She doesn't speak, she doesn't play. Most of the time, she doesn't even acknowledge that people are in the room. If you try to force her, she will retreat further. If you fail her, you leave. Immediately. I don't intend to fail her, Sofia said. Alessandro opened the door. The room was bathed in the late afternoon sun, and Isabella was in her usual spot by the window, her back to them. The silence in the room was thick, a physical weight that usually made the nanny start babbling to fill the void. Sofia did something Alessandro didn't expect. She didn't rush to the child. She didn't coo or use a high-pitched baby voice. She walked to the opposite corner of the room, sat cross-legged on the floor, and began to unpack a small bag she had brought. She took out a set of watercolors and a heavy pad of paper. For 10 minutes, the only sound was the dipping of a brush into water. Alessandro stood in the shadows of the doorway, watching. Sofia began to paint, her movements fluid and rhythmic. She didn't look at Isabella. She didn't ask her for her name. She simply existed in the space, creating a quiet, peaceful bubble that sat in stark contrast to the tension of the rest of the house. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Isabella's head tilted. A few minutes later, the girl shifted her body, turning slightly away from the window to peek at the woman in the red dress. Sofia didn't acknowledge the movement. She just hummed a low, wordless melody, her brush dancing across the paper. Alessandro felt a strange tightening in his chest. He had seen the best child psychologists in the country try to engage Isabella with expensive toys and structured play. They had all failed because they were trying to fix her. Sofia looked like she was simply waiting for her. "Leave you to it," Alessandro whispered, though he wasn't sure if he was speaking to Sofia or to the ghost of the father he used to be. He retreated to his study, but he didn't look at the ledgers. He pulled up the security feed for the playroom. He watched as, over the next hour, Isabella crawled a few inches closer to Sofia. She didn't speak, and Sofia didn't try to make her. But for the first time in 2 years, Isabella wasn't staring at the guards outside. She was looking at the colors on the paper. Later that evening, Silas entered the study, his face a mask of suspicion. "The new girl. She's too calm, Alessandro. It's unnatural. My men tried to rattle her in the kitchen during dinner. They were talking about the disposal of the Lucchese driver. She just asked them if they could pass the salt and told them their language was inappropriate for a house with a child." Alessandro leaned back, a ghost of a smile touching his lips, the first in a long time. "She's either the most dangerous woman you've ever brought me, Silas, or she's exactly what this house has been missing." "She's a liability," Silas hissed. "She doesn't fear you, and if she doesn't fear you, we can't control her." "I don't want to control her," Alessandro said, his eyes returning to the monitor where Sofia was now sitting side by side with Isabella, the red dress and the yellow dress blending in the twilight. "I want her to bring my daughter back. If she can do that, she can have the keys to the kingdom." He watched as Sofia reached out and with a gentle movement, tucked a stray lock of hair behind Isabella's ear. Isabella didn't flinch. In the cold, mahogany prison of the Moretti estate, a single ray of light had finally found a way through the bars, and for the first time, the devil of Chicago felt the stirrings of a hope that was more terrifying than any war. The silence that had once been a suffocating weight in the Moretti mansion began to shift, transforming from a void into a canvas. 2 weeks had passed since Sofia Bennett arrived in her red dress, and in that time she had done the impossible. She had stayed. More importantly, she had remained unbothered by the darkness. While the men in the hallways cleaned their sidearms and spoke in hushed, violent tones about territory disputes, Sofia sat on the floor of the playroom, her world reduced to the size of a watercolor tray and a sheet of textured paper. Alessandro watched her through the high-definition lens of the security camera in his study, his breath hitching as he witnessed a miracle in slow motion. On the screen, the sunlight was beginning to fade, casting long, golden honey streaks across the room. Sofia was painting a garden, Not the sterile, guarded perimeter of the estate, but a wild, overgrown place of lavender and sunflowers. She didn't ask Isabella to join her. She didn't even look at the girl. She simply left a second brush and a small jar of clean water on a piece of paper right next to Isabella's knee. For nearly an hour, nothing happened. Isabella sat like a statue, her small hands balled into fists in the lap of her pale dress. Then with a tentative, trembling grace, the girl's fingers reached out. She picked up the brush. She dipped it into the blue pigment and pressed it to the paper. It was a single, shaky stroke, but to Alessandro, it felt like the first crack in a dam that had been holding back a flood for 2 years. Sofia didn't cheer. She didn't startle the child with praise. She simply dipped her own brush into the same blue and painted a cloud next to Isabella's stroke, a silent acknowledgement that they were now existing in the same world. Alessandro leaned forward, his hands gripping the edge of his mahogany desk so hard his knuckles turned white. He felt a lump form in his throat, a raw, aching sensation he hadn't experienced since he was a boy. He was a man who dealt in the absolute life or death, loyalty or betrayal, but the subtlety of this connection was something he couldn't quantify. It was beautiful and it terrified him. As the days bled into the 3rd week, the patient magic intensified. The playroom was no longer a place where Isabella sat to wait for the day to end. It became a sanctuary. Alessandro found himself drawn to the door more often, standing in the shadows of the hallway just to listen. He didn't hear words yet, but he heard the soft clink of water jars, the rustle of paper, and occasionally the low, soothing hum of Sofia's voice as she told stories to the air, knowing Isabella was absorbing every word. One afternoon, a sudden summer thunderstorm broke over the estate. The sky turned a bruised purple, and a violent crack of thunder shook the reinforced windows of the mansion. In the past, such noises would send Isabella into a catatonic state, her eyes wide and glazed as she relived the fire that took her mother. Alessandro moved toward the playroom, his heart racing, ready to burst in and take her to the basement. He stopped at the threshold. The door cracked just an inch. Isabella was trembling, her small shoulders hunched toward her ears, but she wasn't alone in her fear. Sofia had moved from her spot on the floor. She was sitting on the window seat, and Isabella was pressed against her side, her small head buried in the beige fabric of Sofia's apron. Sofia didn't pull her away or tell her to be brave. She simply wrapped a protective arm around the girl's shoulders, her hand resting over Isabella's heart, anchoring her to the present. "It's just the sky finding its voice, Isabella," Sofia whispered, her voice a calm anchor in the storm. "It's okay to be loud sometimes. Even the clouds get heavy." Alessandro watched as Isabella's tiny hand reached up and clutched the fabric of Sofia's red dress. It was the first time his daughter had initiated physical contact with anyone since the funeral. Not even Alessandro, her own father, had been allowed that closeness. He felt a sharp, bitter sting of jealousy, followed immediately by a wave of profound relief that threatened to buckle his knees. He realized then that he had been trying to guard Isabella's body with soldiers and fences, but Sofia was guarding her soul with nothing but a red dress and a steady heart. Later that evening, after Isabella had fallen into a peaceful sleep, Alessandro intercepted Sofia in the hallway. The dim sconces cast long shadows over his face, making him look every bit the monster his enemies feared. "She touched your arm today," Alessandro said, his voice a low rumble that lacked its usual bite. Sofia stopped, her gaze meeting his without the slightest hint of submission. "She did. She's starting to remember that she isn't alone in the dark, Mr. Moretti. You're doing what the most expensive doctors in Europe couldn't," Alessandro remarked, stepping closer. The scent of vanilla and rain followed her, a jarring contrast to the smell of old tobacco and gun oil that permeated his life. "Why? Why don't you fear this house? Why don't you fear me?" Sofia looked at the tattoos on his forearms, then back up at his cold, dark eyes. "Because I've seen real monsters, Alessandro. They don't usually build fences to keep their daughters safe. They don't watch security cameras for hours just to see if a child picks up a paintbrush. You aren't a monster to her. You're just a man who is lost in his own silence." Alessandro stiffened, the truth of her words cutting through his armor. He wanted to dismiss her, to remind her of her place, but the words wouldn't come. He was fascinated by her. In his world, everyone wanted something: power, money, or mercy. But Sofia Bennett seemed to want nothing but the sound of Isabella's voice. "Silas thinks you're a liability," Alessandro said, testing her. "He thinks your lack of fear makes you dangerous." "Perhaps I am," Sofia replied with a faint, enigmatic smile. "Danger isn't always about violence. Sometimes the most dangerous thing in a house like this is the truth." She walked past him then, the hem of her red dress brushing against his polished shoes. Alessandro stood in the hallway for a long time after she was gone, the silence of the mansion feeling different than it had before. It was no longer a tomb. It was a house holding its breath. He returned to his study and looked at the painting Sofia and Isabella had created together. It was a messy, vibrant swirl of blues and greens, a defiant splash of color in a world of mahogany and gray. He realized with a jolt of sudden, sharp clarity that he was falling, not into a trap, but into a hope he wasn't prepared for. He looked at the monitors, seeing Silas in the war room, his face twisted in a permanent scowl of suspicion. The snake was in the garden, Alessandro knew. His world was too violent for this kind of peace to last. He looked at the image of his sleeping daughter and felt a fierce, protective heat rise in his chest. He would protect this light Sofia had brought into his home, no matter the cost. But as he watched the digital clock tick toward midnight, he didn't realize that the very man he trusted to guard his back was already preparing to dim that light forever. The silence was being painted over, but beneath the colors, the shadows were beginning to move. Silas Mercer did not move like a man burdened by a conscience. He moved like a shadow that had finally learned how to bite. While the upper floors of the Moretti estate were beginning to breathe with the soft colors of Sofia's watercolors, the basement levels remained a cold, sterile hive of surveillance and suspicion. Silas stood in the flickering light of the security hub, his eyes darting across the monitors. He watched the playback of Alessandro standing in the hallway, looking vulnerable, looking human. To Silas, that wasn't growth, it was rot. In the world of the Chicago outfit, a human heart was nothing more than a target, and Alessandro was hanging a bullseye over his own chest for the sake of a girl in a red dress. Silas reached into his inner suit pocket, his fingers brushing against the cold, plastic casing of a cheap burner phone. It was a small thing, unremarkable and untraceable, but in the right hands, it was more lethal than a hollow-point bullet. He had spent the last decade climbing the ranks of the Moretti syndicate, scrubbing blood from marble floors and silencing witnesses, all while waiting for a moment of weakness he could exploit. He didn't just want the throne. He wanted the peace that came with being the man who held the leash. Alessandro had become erratic, blinded by the silence of a child, and Sofia Bennett was the catalyst for that blindness. She had to be removed, not because she was a threat to the business, but because she was a threat to the fear that kept the business alive. The house was quiet, the kind of heavy, expectant silence that preceded a storm. It was 3 a.m, the hour when even the most vigilant guards grew sluggish, and the ghosts of the Moretti family seemed to roam the hallways. Silas moved with practiced ease, avoiding the primary camera sweeps he had helped program. He reached the servants' wing, a section of the house that felt remarkably different from the mahogany-lined corridors of the main estate. Here, the air was thinner, the floors were simple wood, and the doors didn't have the heavy, ornate handles of the study. He stopped before Sofia's door. He stood there for a moment, listening to the rhythmic, peaceful breathing coming from inside. It was the sound of someone who had nothing to hide, which only made Silas despise her more. To him, innocence was just a lack of imagination. He pulled a master key from his pocket, a key Alessandro didn't know he had, and turned the lock with a click that was no louder than the heartbeat of a bird. The room smelled of vanilla and clean linen. It was a sparse space, save for a few books on childhood development and a small, framed photograph of a younger Sofia standing in front of an old, weathered house. Silas didn't look at the photo. He moved toward the bed, his footsteps silent on the rug. Sofia remained asleep, her face softened by the moonlight filtering through the thin curtains. She looked younger than 26, her hair splayed across the pillow like a silk fan. For a fleeting second, a normal man might have felt a twinge of hesitation, a flicker of guilt at the life he was about to dismantle. But Silas was not a normal man. He was a creature of the dark, and he knew that to survive in Alessandro's world, you had to be willing to burn everything that was pure. He reached beneath the edge of the mattress, his gloved hand sliding between the frame and the heavy padding. He tucked the burner phone deep into the center, right where a person might hide a secret they weren't ready to lose. He smoothed the sheets with a clinical touch, ensuring there was no sign of his intrusion. The phone was already preloaded with a series of outgoing calls to a number linked to an FBI task force, a number Silas had carefully procured through his own back-channel contacts. It was a perfect trap, designed to hit Alessandro right in his most calcified nerve, his paranoia. As he retreated toward the door, Silas' gaze fell on a small, hand-painted card sitting on the nightstand. It was a picture of a son, drawn in a shaky 6-year-old hand. Isabella. The girl had started to engage with the world, and Sofia was the reason. Silas felt a surge of cold triumph. He wasn't just planting a phone, he was planting a seed of doubt that would grow into a forest of fire. He knew Alessandro's history. He knew that the boss' first instinct when he felt betrayed was to strike, and to strike with a violence that left no room for questions. Silas stepped back into the hallway, locking the door behind him. He didn't return to his own quarters. Instead, he made his way to the armory, where he began the second phase of his plan. He needed a distraction, something to make the house feel under siege, something to push Alessandro over the edge. He began to feed small, whispered rumors to the captains, hints of a leak, stories of a woman who was too curious, a nanny who spent too much time looking at the security cameras. By dawn, the atmosphere of the estate had shifted. The guards were no longer just standing post, they were watching each other. The air was thick with a renewed tension, a jagged edge that cut through the peace Sofia had worked so hard to build. Alessandro emerged from his study, his eyes bloodshot and his jaw set in a hard, grim line. He had spent the night looking at logistics, but his mind was on the woman in the red dress. He didn't see the way Silas watched him from the shadows of the mezzanine, a serpent waiting for the venom to take hold. The patient magic was about to meet the brutal reality. Silas had spent years building a fortress of loyalty, and he was more than happy to burn it down if it meant he was the only one left standing in the ashes. He checked his own phone, the clean one, and saw the confirmation he was waiting for. The anonymous tip about a mole in the Moretti house was being processed. The FBI would make a move, a small, subtle move that would look like a coordination with an insider. He watched as Sofia descended the stairs, her expression bright and her steps light as she headed toward Isabella's room. She didn't know that the floor beneath her feet was already beginning to crack. She didn't know that the man she had called, just a man lost in his own silence, was about to become the monster the world feared once more. Silas leaned against the cold marble of the railing, a ghost of a smile playing on his thin lips. The seeds were planted, the soil was rich with blood, and the harvest of betrayal was only a few hours away. The red dress wouldn't be enough to save her from the darkness he had unleashed. The morning light did not break over the Moretti estate. It bled across the stone like a warning. Alessandro stood in the center of Sofia's small bedroom, his presence a dark, jagged tear in the quiet sanctuary she had built. In his hand, he held the small, silver burner phone that Silas had discovered during a sweep of the servants' quarters. To Alessandro, it wasn't just a piece of plastic and circuitry. It was a dagger buried in the one soft place left in his heart. The logs were damning, short, coded calls to a known FBI task force frequency. He felt the familiar, cold calcification taking over his chest, a granite wall rising up to bury the man who had almost allowed himself to hope. When the door opened, Sofia walked in carrying a tray with a single glass of orange juice and a small bowl of sliced fruit for Isabella. She stopped dead, the tray rattling slightly in her hands as she took in the sight of the 3 armed guards flanking the door and Alessandro standing by her bed, his face a mask of such profound, icy detachment that he looked less like a man and more like a statue carved from graveyard marble. "Alessandro," she whispered, the use of his first name a habit of the heart she hadn't yet learned to break. He didn't move. He didn't even seem to breathe. He simply held up the phone, the screen still glowing with the ghost of a fabricated betrayal. "I spent 2 years building a wall of silence to keep the world out," he said, his voice a low, rhythmic growl that lacked any trace of the warmth they had shared in the hallways. "I thought you were the one person who understood that silence. But you weren't painting with Isabella, Sofia. You were measuring the distance between the gates and the front door." Sofia's face went pale, her expressive eyes wide with a mix of shock and a dawning horrific comprehension. She set the tray down on the small wooden desk, her hands trembling. "I don't know what that is. I've never seen that phone in my life." "Was under your mattress," Alessandro countered, stepping toward her. The guards shifted, their hands hovering near their holsters. "The same mattress where you sleep after spending your days winning the trust of a child who has already lost everything." "Did they promise you immunity, or was it just money?" "Look at me," Sofia pleaded, taking a step forward despite the rifles aimed at her heart. "You know me. You've watched me for months. Do you really believe I could look Isabella in the eye every morning if I were planning to hand her over to a cage? You told me you were a man who valued the truth. The truth is standing right in front of you." Alessandro's jaw tightened so hard a muscle pulsed in his cheek. He wanted to believe her. Every instinct that had kept him alive in the underworld was screaming that this was too simple, too clean. But the evidence was a physical weight in his hand, and Silas whispers about her. Curiosity had already poisoned the well. In his world, a mistake of the heart was a death sentence for everyone involved. He couldn't afford to be wrong about her twice. "You have 15 minutes, Alessandro said, his words falling like shards of glass. Sofia froze. "What? 15 minutes to gather whatever belongs to you and get past the main gate," he continued, his gaze fixed on a point just above her head because he knew if he looked into her eyes he might shatter. "If you are still on this property in 16 minutes, my men have orders to treat you as an enemy combatant. There will be no trial. There will be no explanation. You will simply cease to exist." "Alessandro, please," she cried, the first tear finally breaking and tracing a path down her cheek. "Don't do this to her. Isabella is just starting to come back. If you send me away like this, without a word, without a goodbye, you aren't just firing a nanny. You're confirming every fear she has that the people she loves will always vanish. People she loves are the ones who don't sell her out to the feds." Alessandro roared, the sudden explosion of his voice making the guards jump. He closed the distance between them in a single, predatory stride, looming over her, his shadow swallowing her whole. "I gave you the keys to my home. I gave you the safety of my daughter. And you used it to build a bridge for the people who want to put me in a hole for the rest of my life. You're lucky I am letting you walk out of here at all. Most people who betray a Morty don't get 15 minutes. They don't even get 15 seconds. He turned his back on her, a gesture of absolute dismissal that cut deeper than any blade. "Go," he commanded. Sofia stood there for a heartbeat, her chest heaving with silent, racking sobs. She looked at the small, hand-painted card Isabella had made for her still sitting on the nightstand. She reached for it, but Marco, the guard, stepped in her way, his hand roughly shoving her back. "Boss said your things," Marco grunted. "Not the kids." Sofia didn't fight him. She realized with a hollow, sickening finality that the man standing in front of her wasn't the father she had seen watching the security monitors with tears in his eyes. He was the devil of Chicago again, a man who had chosen the safety of his walls over the risk of a heart. She moved with a numb, mechanical speed, throwing her few clothes into her suitcase. She didn't look at Alessandro again. She couldn't. As she walked down the grand staircase for the last time, her suitcase trailing behind her with a hollow thud on the marble steps, the house felt colder than it ever had. The guards watched her with expressions ranging from boredom to a cruel, hidden satisfaction. She reached the front doors and stepped out into the blinding, indifferent sunshine of the driveway. The silver sedan she had arrived in was gone, replaced by a black SUV with two drivers who didn't look at her. "The city limits," Alessandro's voice came from the intercom by the door, distorted and metallic. And if you ever approach this fence again, Sofia Bennett, God himself, won't be able to help you." Gates groaned open, a long, mournful sound that echoed through the trees. As the SUV pulled away, Sofia looked back one last time. High up in the second-floor window, she saw a small, pale hand resting against the reinforced glass. Isabella was there, watching her savior disappear into the dust of the driveway. Inside the study, Alessandro stood with his back to the monitors, his eyes closed and his forehead pressed against the cool mahogany of the wall. He heard the distant sound of the gates closing, a final, heavy metallic clank that signaled the return of the silence. He thought he had saved his house. He thought he had protected his empire. He didn't know that in the room down the hall, his daughter had just watched the only light in her life be extinguished by her father's hand. He didn't know that the silence that was about to return wasn't just a lack of sound. It was the beginning of a heartbreak that would lead to a truth far more dangerous than any FBI raid. He had given the order to disappear, but he was the one who was truly lost. The silence that followed Sofia's departure was not the peaceful quiet Alessandro had envisioned. It was a pressurized vacuum that seemed to make the very walls of the Moretti estate groan. In the hours after the black SUV disappeared beyond the gates, the house had turned frigid. Alessandro sat in his study, the burner phone lying on his desk like a dead insect, but he couldn't focus on the ledgers or the security feeds. He was haunted by the phantom scent of vanilla and the memory of a red dress flickering against the gray stone. He told himself he had done the right thing, that in his world, a moment of hesitation was a death sentence, but his chest felt as though it had been hollowed out with a rusted blade. The breaking point came just after sunset. Alessandro was startled by a sound that didn't belong in his fortress, a sharp, splintering crash followed by a low, guttural wail. He moved before he was even conscious of it, his hand instinctively reaching for the sidearm at his waist as he sprinted toward the playroom. He found the heavy oak door standing open, the room inside a chaotic mess of overturned chairs and scattered watercolors. But Isabella wasn't there. He followed the sound of frantic, rhythmic thudding to the small, walk-in closet in the corner of the room, the place where Isabella used to hide when the nightmares were too loud. The door was locked from the inside. "Isabella." "Open the door," Alessandro commanded, his voice cracking with a desperation he couldn't hide. He hammered on the wood, his heart hammering against his ribs in a terrifying echo. "Bella, please, it's Papa. Open the door." There was no answer, only the sound of something heavy being dragged against the floor and the muffled, ragged gasps of a child who had reached the end of her endurance. Alessandro didn't hesitate. He stepped back and threw his entire weight against the door. The frame splintered, the lock giving way with a violent snap as he tumbled into the cramped, dark space. He stopped, frozen by the sight before him. Isabella was huddled in the furthest corner, surrounded by the coats and dresses of the mother she had lost. She was clutching the hand-painted sun card Sofia had tried to take with her, the one the guard had stepped on. The paper was crumpled and torn, and Isabella's small face was a mask of raw, agonizing fury. She looked up at him, her brown eyes no longer hollow but burning with a fire that made the devil of Chicago flinch. Then the miracle happened, but it was wrapped in a nightmare. Isabella didn't just speak, she screamed. It was a sound that tore through 2 years of silence, a jagged, visceral release of all the pain she had been carrying. "You sent her away," she shrieked, the words coming out in a torrent of choked sobs. "You sent her to the bad man. You're the monster." "You're the monster." Alessandro fell to his knees, the shock of her voice hitting him like a physical blow. He reached out for her, but she struck his hands away, her tiny fists pounding against his chest. "Bella, I had to. She was dangerous. She was talking to the police." "No," Isabella yelled, her voice raw and vibrating with a truth that silenced his excuses. "She was hiding. She was hiding me from the snake man. He told me. He told me if I talked to you, he would make me sleep in the ground like mommy. He told me Sofia was going to die because I loved her." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Alessandro's breath caught in his throat, a cold, sickening realization dawning in the pit of his stomach. "The snake man. Isabella, who told you that?" Isabella was shaking now, her entire body vibrating with the force of her revelation. She pointed a trembling finger toward the doorway, toward the shadows of the hallway where Silas Mercer often lurked. "The man with the cold eyes. The man who gave me the phone to put under the bed. He said it was a game. He said if I didn't hide it, Sofia would go away forever. But you sent her anyway. He lied. You lied." The air in the closet turned to ice. Alessandro felt a roar of blood in his ears so loud it drowned out the sound of the rain starting to lash against the windows. The burner phone. The discovery. Silas' constant whispers about Sofia's curiosity. It hadn't been a betrayal by the nanny. It had been a surgical strike by the man he called his brother. Silas hadn't just framed Sofia. He had used a traumatized 6-year-old girl to plant the evidence, knowing Alessandro's paranoia would do the rest of the work. Alessandro looked at his daughter, really looked at her, and saw the sheer, unadulterated terror he had allowed to grow under his own roof. He had built a fortress to keep the world out, but he had left the most dangerous predator inside the nursery. He had punished the only person who had ever truly loved Isabella, and in doing so, he had become the very monster his daughter was calling him. A sob broke from Alessandro's throat, a deep, ragged sound of a man being dismantled by the truth. He crawled forward and wrapped his massive arms around Isabella, and this time she didn't fight him. She collapsed against his chest, her small frame shaking with the force of her grief, her tears soaking into his expensive suit. "I'm sorry," he whispered into her hair, his voice breaking as he wept openly for the first time in his adult life. "I'm so sorry, Bella. Papa was wrong. Papa was so blind." He stayed there for a long time, rocking his daughter in the dark of the closet, the silence of the mansion now filled with the sound of their shared wreckage. But as the grief began to settle, it was replaced by a cold, incandescent rage, a fury so dark it made his previous ruthlessness look like a shadow. He had been played. He had been used to hurt his own child and discard the woman who had saved her. He pulled back, holding Isabella's face in his hands. His eyes were no longer the cold, calculated eyes of a boss. They were the eyes of a father who had found his purpose. "Where is Sofia, Bella? Did she tell you where she was going?" she said. "She said she had to go to the Starlight," Isabella whispered, her voice fatting back into a fragile thread. "She said it was the only place she knew." Alessandro stood up, his muscular frame filling the small closet. He didn't call for his guards. He didn't check the monitors. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his encrypted phone, his fingers moving with a terrifying focused speed. He knew the Starlight. It was a remote, crumbling motel 30 miles outside the city, a place where people went when they wanted to disappear, or when they were meant to be found by someone who didn't want them to leave. He looked down at Isabella, who was watching him with a mix of fear and a tiny, flickering hope. "Stay here," he said, his voice dropping into a tone of absolute lethal command. "Lock the door. Don't open it for anyone but me. Do you understand?" Isabella nodded, clutching the torn Sun card to her chest. Alessandro stepped out of the closet and into the hallway. The devil of Chicago was gone. In his place was a man who was ready to burn the entire world to the ground to find the woman in the red dress. He saw Silas standing at the end of the corridor, a look of feigned concern on his face as he approached. "Alessandro, is everything all right? I heard a scream." Alessandro didn't answer with words. He walked past Silas, the sheer force of his presence making the underboss stumble back against the wall. Alessandro didn't look at him. He didn't reveal what he knew. Not yet. He had a race to run, a life to save, and a debt of blood to pay. As he reached the grand staircase, his mind was already 30 miles away, at a flickering neon sign in the rain. He had been a king of shadows for too long. It was time to let the fire in. The rain did not just fall. It lashed against the reinforced glass of the Moretti estate like 1,000 accusing fingers. Inside the master study, the air was thick with the scent of ozone and the heavy, metallic tang of a rage that had finally found its target. Alessandro stood before the wall of security monitors, but he wasn't looking at the perimeter. He was looking at the digital trail Silas Mercer had left behind, the subtle, ghost-like deletions in the server logs that only a man blinded by trust would have missed. Every piece of the puzzle was falling into place with a sickening, rhythmic thud. The burner phone, The anonymous tip, the way Silas had been the first to discover, the evidence under Sofia's mattress. It was a masterpiece of betrayal, painted in the colors of Alessandro's own paranoia. He felt a wave of nausea roll through him, followed immediately by an inferno of regret that scorched his throat. He had looked at Sofia, the woman who had taught his daughter how to breathe again, and seen a monster. He had looked at Silas, the man who had threatened to bury his child in the mud, and seen a brother. The irony was a jagged blade twisting in his chest. Alessandro's hands, usually as steady as a marksman's, trembled as he pulled a heavy, silver-plated .45 from his desk drawer. He didn't check the chamber. He knew it was ready. He had been ready for war his entire life, but he had never imagined the front line would be his own hallway. He moved through the house with a silent, lethal purpose that made the air seem to freeze in his wake. The guards he passed sensed the shift. They flattened themselves against the mahogany walls, sensing that the Devil of Chicago was no longer just a title. It was an active state of being. He reached the tactical room, a windowless bunker where Silas was currently overseeing the heightened security he had used as a cover for his coup. Silas turned as Alessandro entered, his face settling into a mask of practiced concern. "Alessandro, I was just reviewing the Genovese movements. We need to be careful." The words died in Silas' throat as Alessandro closed the distance in 3 strides. He didn't use the gun. He used his hand, his fingers locking around Silas' throat with the force of a hydraulic press. He slammed the underboss against the metal server rack, the impact sending a shudder through the glowing monitors. "Snake Man," Alessandro whispered, his voice so low and vibrating with fury that it sounded like a growl from the bottom of a well. "That's what Isabella calls you. She told me about the game, Silas. She told me about the phone. She told me about the threats you whispered into her ear while I was busy counting my money and staring at my walls." Silas' eyes bulged, his face turning a mottled purple as he clawed at Alessandro's iron grip. She's traumatized, Alessandro. You can't trust a child's." Alessandro tightened his grip, his thumb pressing into the soft tissue of Silas' windpipe until the man's words turned into a pathetic wet wheeze. "She didn't speak for 2 years because of you. She watched her mother die, and you used that fear like a leash. You didn't just betray me, Silas. You broke a 6-year-old girl to get to a throne that was never yours to sit on." He threw Silas to the floor, the underboss gasping and retching for air. Alessandro stood over him, the light from the monitors casting long, demonic shadows across his tattooed forearms. For a moment, he wanted to end it there, to let the lead solve the problem of the man who had poisoned his home. But a quick death was too merciful for what Silas had done. He needed Sofia back. He needed to know exactly what Silas had set in motion. "Where are they?" Alessandro demanded, his boot pressing into Silas' chest, pinning him to the cold linoleum. "The hitmen you sent to the Starlight Inn. Give me their names, or I will let my captain spend the next 3 days explaining to you why loyalty matters." Silas let out a choked, desperate laugh, blood speckling his lips. "It's too late, Alessandro. They're professionals, they don't miss. By the time you get to that motel, your little Nanny will be just another body in a ditch. You did the hard part for me. You kicked her out, you made her a target." Inferno in Alessandro's chest flared into a white-hot sun. He didn't waste another second. He brought the butt of his pistol down across Silas' temple, a sharp, sickening crack echoing through the room. Silas went limp, his head lolling to the side. Alessandro looked up at the 2 guards standing by the door, their faces pale with shock. "Secure him," Alessandro commanded, his voice as sharp as a razor. "Put him in the basement. If he stops breathing before I get back, you'll take his place in the concrete. Do you understand?" "Yes, boss," they stammered in unison. Alessandro didn't wait for a reply. He was already moving, his mind a blur of maps and timelines. He reached the garage and climbed into his blackest, fastest SUV, the engine roaring to life with a predatory snarl. He tore out of the estate, the tires screaming against the wet gravel as he smashed through his own gates. As he sped onto the highway, the rain turned into a torrential downpour, blurring the world into a smear of gray and black. He pushed the needle toward 120, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. Every second felt like an hour. Every mile felt like a betrayal. He thought of Sofia's face when he had given her 15 minutes to disappear, the way her eyes had filled with a disbelief that should have shattered his resolve. He thought of the way she had tucked Isabella's hair behind her ear, a gesture of pure, unselfish love that he had mistaken for a calculated move. "Please," he whispered into the darkness of the cabin, a prayer to a God he hadn't spoken to in decades. "Just let me be on time. Let me be the monster she needs me to be one last time." Guilt was a physical weight pressing against his lungs. He had built a fortress of mahogany and iron, but it had been a house of cards, held together by the lies of a traitor and the silence of a child. Sofia had been the only real thing in his life, the only light that didn't come from a security monitor, and he had thrown her into the dark. The neon sign for the starlight flickered in the distance, a sickly green pulse against the storm. Alessandro felt his heart seize. He saw a silver sedan parked in the shadows of the far unit, and next to it, a nondescript van with its lights off. His instincts, honed by years of bloodshed, screamed that the wolves were already at the door. He didn't slow down. He didn't look for a parking spot. He slammed his foot on the accelerator, his vehicle becoming a 3-ton projectile of regret and retribution, heading straight for the heart of the storm. He had fired the nanny for no reason, but he would burn the world to bring her home. The neon sign of the starlight flickered in a rhythmic, sickly green pulse that mirrored the frantic beating of Alessandro's heart. Rain lashed against the windshield of the SUV, blurring the world into a smear of asphalt and shadow as he tore off the main highway. He didn't slow down for the gravel turn-in. He drifted the heavy vehicle through the mud, the tires screaming in a high-pitched mechanical wail that cut through the thunder. Every muscle in his body was coiled with a lethal, desperate tension. He had spent his life orchestrating violence from behind mahogany desks and reinforced glass, but this was different. This wasn't business. This was a soul-crushing race against a clock he had wound himself when he gave the order to cast Sofia out. He saw her car, the modest silver sedan that had once represented a threat to his empire, but now represented the only light he had left. It was parked in front of room 114, isolated at the far end of the horseshoe-shaped motel. Next to it sat a nondescript black van, its engine idling with a low, predatory hum. Two shadows moved against the rain-streaked windows of the room, their silhouettes sharp and unmistakable. They weren't there to talk. They were the cleanup crew Silas had sent to ensure the nanny problem was permanently erased. Alessandro didn't reach for the brakes. He slammed his foot onto the accelerator, steering the 3-ton SUV straight for the van. The impact was a bone-shaking roar of grinding metal and shattering glass. The van was tossed aside like a toy, skidding across the wet pavement and slamming into a support pillar. Before the airbags could even deflate, Alessandro was out of the door, his silver-plated .45 drawn and his eyes burning with a cold, incandescent rage. The door to room 114 burst open. A man in a tactical jacket emerged, raising a suppressed submachine gun, but Alessandro was faster. He didn't think. He reacted with the muscle memory of a man born in the trenches of a gang war. 2 shots rang out, muffled by the torrential downpour, and the hitman collapsed into the mud. Roared, his voice cracking with a raw, visceral fear he hadn't felt since the day the car bomb took his wife. He kicked the door the rest of the way open, stepping into the dim, yellow light of the motel room. The air tasted of cheap cigarettes and copper. A second man was lunging for a weapon on the nightstand, but Alessandro didn't give him the chance. He tackled the intruder, the force of his momentum carrying them both over the bolted-down table. They crashed onto the threadbare carpet in a tangle of limbs and snarls. Alessandro didn't fight like a boss. He fought like a wounded animal, his fists falling with a rhythmic, brutal efficiency until the man beneath him went still. He scrambled to his feet, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gulps. "Sofia! Sofia, where are you?" He saw her then, huddled in the corner of the bathroom, her red dress torn at the shoulder and her face a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. She was clutching a heavy ceramic lamp base, her knuckles white and her eyes wide with the shock of the violence that had just shattered her world. When she saw him, covered in rain, blood speckling his white shirt, his tattoos bared to the flickering overhead light, she didn't run to him. She shrank further into the shadows. "Did you come to finish it?" she whispered, her voice a fragile, broken thing that cut through Alessandro deeper than any bullet could. "Did 15 minutes run out, Alessandro?" The words hit him with the force of a physical blow. Dropped his gun, the heavy metal thudding onto the carpet, and held up his hands in a gesture of absolute surrender. He stayed on his knees, refusing to move any closer, his chest heaving as the adrenaline began to ebb, leaving behind nothing but the cold, crushing weight of his own regret. "No," he gasped, the tears he had held back for years finally breaking and tracing hot paths through the rain and grime on his face. "No, Sofia, I came. I came because I was a fool. I was blind. Isabella. She told me everything." Sofia's breath hitched, the lamp base trembling in her hands. "Isabella spoke," she screamed, Alessandro corrected, his voice breaking. "She screamed the truth until the walls shook. She told me about the snake man. She told me about the phone Silas made her hide. She told me that you weren't the traitor. You were the only one who was actually keeping her alive." He crawled forward a few inches, his head bowed. "I sent you to your death, Sofia. I looked at the person who saved my daughter and I treated her like an enemy. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't even expect you to look at me. But please, please come home. Isabella is waiting in the closet with the door locked, and she won't come out until she hears your voice." Silence that followed was filled only by the rhythmic dripping of the faucet and the distant, fatting rumble of the storm. Sofia looked at the man on his knees, the most feared man in Chicago, the devil who built a fortress to hide his heart, and saw the wreckage of a father who had finally realized what he was fighting for. Slowly, she lowered the lamp. She moved toward him, her steps hesitant and shaky, until she was standing directly over him. She reached out, her fingers brushing the wet hair away from his forehead. Her touch was soft, a jarring contrast to the violence that had just occurred in the room. "You almost lost everything, Alessandro," she murmured. "Not because of a traitor, but because you forgot how to trust the light." "I know," he whispered, leaning his forehead against her hand, his shoulders shaking with silent, racking sobs. "I know." He stayed there for a long time, anchored by her presence. Outside, the sirens began to wail in the distance. His own men, or perhaps the police, it didn't matter. The fortress had been breached, the walls had fallen, and for the first time in his life, Alessandro Moretti wasn't afraid of the shadows. He stood up, his movements slow and weary, and wrapped his coat around Sofia's shoulders, shielding her from the sight of the men on the floor. "Let's go," he said, his voice regaining a shred of its former authority, but tempered now with a newfound tenderness. "We have a little girl who needs to know that the monsters are gone." As they walked out into the rain, Alessandro didn't look at the wreckage of the SUV or the bodies in the mud. He looked at Sofia. He held her hand with a grip that promised he would never let go again, not for protocol, not for paranoia, and not for all the power in the city. The race was over, the midnight at the Starlight had passed, and though the road ahead was still dark, he finally knew the way home. The return to the Moretti estate was not a triumphal procession, but a quiet, fragile homecoming. The rain had ceased, leaving the air smelling of wet earth and cooling stone. As the black SUV rolled through the iron gates, the guards stood at a distance, their gazes averted, sensing that the internal foundations of the empire had shifted irrevocably. Alessandro didn't wait for the vehicle to fully stop before he stepped out, his hand instinctively reaching back for Sofia. She took it, her fingers still trembling slightly, but her eyes held a steady, shimmering light. She was no longer just the nanny in the red dress. She was the woman who had walked through the fire and stayed whole. Inside the grand foyer, the mahogany walls seemed less like the bars of a cage and more like the frame of a house waiting to be filled. Alessandro led her up the stairs, his pace hurried yet cautious. They reached the playroom door, which still bore the splintered scars of Alessandro's desperate entry. He pushed it open, and for a moment the silence returned, but it was a silence of anticipation, not of grief. Isabella was sitting on the floor, the torn Sun card still clutched in her lap. When she looked up and saw Sofia standing there, her small face underwent a transformation that no amount of gold could ever buy. She didn't scream this time. She simply stood up, her breath hitching in a tiny, sob-like gasp, and ran. She collided with Sofia's knees, burying her face in the beige apron, her small hands gripping the fabric as if she were trying to anchor herself to the earth. Sofia dropped to her knees, pulling the girl into a fierce, protective embrace. Alessandro stood in the doorway, his large frame casting a shadow that no longer felt oppressive. He watched them, the devil of Chicago, reduced to a man who finally understood that his true wealth wasn't in the ledgers in his study, but in the sound of a child's quiet weeping against a shoulder she trusted. "I'm here, Bella," Sofia whispered, her voice a soothing balm that seemed to smooth the very air in the room. "I am not going anywhere, I promise." Alessandro stepped into the room and knelt beside them, his massive tattooed hand resting gently on Isabella's back. He looked at Sofia over his daughter's head, an unspoken vow passing between them in the dim twilight. He had almost lost this. He had almost allowed the shadows of his past and the poison of a traitor to destroy the only light he had left. The justice for Silas Mercer had been swift and absolute. In the hours before Sofia's return, Alessandro had ensured that the rot was excised. Silas would never see the sun again, his treachery buried beneath the very concrete foundations he had tried to seize. But the true transformation was not in the blood spilled. It was in the way Alessandro looked at the monitors when he returned to his study. He began to dismantle the architecture of fear. He gave orders to dial back the aggressive expansions, to settle the blood feuds with the rival families, and to begin the slow, arduous process of moving the Moretti name into the light of legitimate commerce. He realized that a fortress built only for defense was just a high-end tomb. If he wanted his daughter to grow, he had to give her a world worth living in. Weeks turned into months, and the atmosphere of the estate underwent a slow magic of its own. The heavy, light-blocking curtains were pulled back, allowing the sun to spill across the marble floors. The gardens, once just a killing field for motion sensors, were now filled with the scents of lavender and jasmine that Sofia had insisted on planting. Alessandro found himself spending less time in the tactical room and more time in the sunlit gardens, watching Isabella and Sofia. Isabella was talking now, not in the guarded, fearful way of the past, but with a vibrant, curious energy that filled the house with life. She laughed as she chased fireflies, and she told stories about the characters in the books Sofia read to her. She was no longer a hollow shell. She was a child who knew she was loved, protected by a father who had traded his paranoia for a heart. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of violet and gold, Alessandro stood on the terrace with Sofia. He looked out at the rolling lawns where the guards still stood watch, but their presence felt different now. They were guardians of a home, not jailers of a prison. "You were right," Alessandro murmured, his voice filled with a quiet, unshakable peace. "About the windows. I spent so much time trying to keep the world out that I forgot to let the light in." Sofia leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder. "Every fortress needs a little light, Alessandro, even yours." He tightened his arm around her, looking down at Isabella, who was sitting on the grass nearby, painting a picture of a house with wide-open doors. The devil of Chicago had been brought to his knees by a child's scream and a nanny's courage, and in the wreckage of his old life, he had found something far more powerful than absolute loyalty. He had found a family. The Moretti estate was still a fortress, but the iron was no longer cold. The mahogany was no longer dark. As the first stars began to twinkle over the Chicago skyline, the house sat on its 30 acres not as a nerve center of crime, but as a sanctuary of hope. The silence was gone, replaced by the soft sounds of a life well lived, and for the first time in his life, Alessandro Moretti wasn't afraid of what the morning would bring. He had fired the nanny for no reason, but he had brought her home for every reason in the world.